All right, let's get started. We have an excellent panel today, and I don't want to waste any more time with silence. So we'll get underway. Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on the topic of the 10th anniversary of South Sudan, hosted by the Small Arms Survey and its Mapping Actors and Alliances project in South Sudan. I am Christopher Carlson. I'm the coordinator of the project, which we run out of our Nairobi office. So thanks again for all the attendees today, and of course to our panelists. And I'll hand things over to my colleague Joshua in just a moment, and he will provide an introduction of our panelists today. So I will just provide a few quick words before we shift over to that discussion. If you're new here or you've missed any of our previous webinars, you can find all of those posted on the Small Arms Survey YouTube channel. These include discussions on Upper Nile, Jonglei, Unity State, among others. In addition, there are several available briefs that are available for download. You can find those on the maapps.org website or through the HSBA project page at smallarmsurveysudan.org. There you will also find all of the Small Arms Survey's publications on Sudan and South Sudan. I'll drop a couple of links into the chat box here in a moment to help anybody access any of those things. If you haven't registered already to use the Mapping Actors and Alliances project in South Sudan website and access its over 700 or so profiles, you can do so at the project's at the website project homepage. And if you aren't receiving any emails with project updates or events announcements, please send me an email and I will see that you are added to our list, and you can be privy to what's going on in the coming months. With regard to today's webinar, it will be recorded, of course, because I will post it on the YouTube channel. If you have any questions for today's panelists, please use the Q&A function and not the chat box. Questions will remain anonymous, thus you won't be identified here, and that goes for the recording as well, of course. Moderating today's discussion is my colleague Joshua Craze, a longtime researcher associated with the Small Arms Survey and its HSBA project, and author of several of its publications. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion, and Joshua, please, I hand things over to you.
Thanks, Christopher. So as regular attendees will know, the last few webinars we've been doing have been really deep dives on different states. All you need to know, we've been going sometimes into mind-numbing levels of detail about the particular political dynamics of Unity or of Upper Nile. And this month, as it's the anniversary of 10 years of South Sudanese independence, we're going to take a step back and we're going to say more generally, historically, how is South Sudan doing? And to do that, we've assembled an all-star team of panelists. We have Brian Adeba, who is the lost who everyone is in my mind, but I want to give them their proper titles. Brian Adeba is the Deputy Director of Policy for the Sentry. We have Nyagoah Tut Pur, Human Rights Watch's South Sudan researcher. We have Small Arms Survey's own Ferenc Dávid Markó, and we have Alan Boswell, the International Crisis Group Senior Analyst for South Sudan. So the way this will work is that each of them will get 3 to 4 minutes to answer the simple question, South Sudan, how is it faring? You do actually have to use your whole 3 to 4 minutes and not just say badly, Alan. And then after that, we will open up to people responding to those questions. And so if you want to have questions, as Christopher mentioned, just post them in the Q&A box, and I will then pose them to the researchers. For the panelists, as you listen to things, if you just want to immediately respond to any of your fellow panelists, simply raise your hand and I will call on you. The only thing that I will sort of note in advance is what I'm going to try to do is begin, as it were, with 2005 and with the CPA, maybe looking back at prior histories and move towards the present. So if you're posting questions in the Q&A about what should we do now, what is international community's role, etc., etc., I'm not going to call on those questions to the end, because I fear that if we simply immediately delve into what the future is, then we're going to forget the past. And as our panelists are going to tell us, forgetting the past is the sort of intermittent disease function suffered by many of the people that are interested in South Sudan. So with no more ado, I will call on our first speaker, Brian Adeba. Brian, how is South Sudan faring after 10 years?
To answer that question, I think I want to look at three things that I think are very important to, to give us a perspective about this current situation. Let's take the issue of the social fabric of the country. In 2005, there was a lot of hope. There was unity among the population of South Sudan. The idea of South Sudan as a nation was gelling, and everyone was looking forward with a lot of optimism. Today, that social fabric has been distorted greatly. We in South Sudan have retreated into ethnic cocoons and regionalism, and the population in general is very fragmented. As the political situation also fragments, it's complementary to the fragmentation on the political level. Economically, 2005, there was a lot of oil coming in and there was money. There was a lot of hope. The currency in 2011, after independence, the South Sudan pound was quite strong. People had more money in their pocket, businesses were booming, the country was really settling. If you travel across the country, you'd see that some of us who had been there during the wartime could see the difference. At the moment, the economy is still in free fall. The South Sudan pound has lost a lot of value against the US dollar, and life has generally become really very, very expensive. And then we look at the third element here, which is human security. Over the years, compared to 10 years ago, human security there was a little prospect of things improving. For instance, the state security organ was not after people's necks as it is now. And in 2011, you didn't have the current situation where you had a lot of groups fighting each other. So when you look at the situation right now, the human security condition has deteriorated considerably, and things are not really looking very optimistic for the future as we move on at this particular time. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful and concise and synoptic. Nyagoah, do you have any better news for us about how South Sudan is faring?
I mean, Brian has captured much about where we are today, but there is that sense that we have both stagnated and gone off the rails. A sense of stagnation in terms of where has the process and the project of state building come to, and where are we also at the process of nation building? I think in 2005, as well as in 2009, at independence as well, 2011, it was also, South Sudan has always been faulted for focusing too much on building the basic tenets of a state, but not trying to build a nation that would represent its various ethnicities, as well as ensure proper representation, and that a lot of groups do not feel disenfranchised, as well as marginalized from the process of state building. But where we are today is completely different. We've got what Brian also says are ethnic enclaves, and there is no sense of national identity 10 years into who are South Sudanese and where do they need to go. Much of the human security as well, the state of insecurity. At independence, I think in 2011, I would say 3/4 of South Sudan was in crisis or in conflict, owing to various intercommunal violence, or as owing to various insurgencies as a result of the various disagreements over the 2010 general election. Certainly not to the scale that we've seen over the last 7 years with the national civil war, and definitely within the last 2 years over what we have come to term as subnational or localized violence. So that sense of that there is much that has happened, but it has happened to reverse us back. When it comes to the economy, certainly when you do go to Juba, or when you're having a bird's eye view over the city of Juba, there seems to be a lot of infrastructural developments. But who does that development benefit? A lot of people will point out those towers and the various roads that are being built, some of which are being washed away by rain. But that the little development that is taking place, does it benefit the whole population or a few segments of society?
Thank you, Nyagoah. That's great. Alan, do you have better news for us?
Well, the answer I did prepare was badly, so now I have to come up with a few more things to say. And I apologize for my video, which my laptop is in its final legs and its camera is basically kaput. I think what's interesting listening to the respondents on this is, the failed nation building and its relation to the state building and the degree to which what went wrong in South Sudan was, I think, state building internationally supported, even driven at points, state building process that basically created a very centralized political structure, really reinforced that, and the degree to which that itself is partly what's responsible for the failed nation building. The degree to which this central power struggle, this winner-take-all system that ended up coming, which is obviously largely derivative also of the centralized political economy that's there, but basically just the not very closely interrogated by South Sudanese elites or the international community, the way to which this state building project related to what has been a very failed nation building project on top of that. And underneath that, is a failure by South Sudanese elite, which, we've written about it at Craze Group quite a bit to forge a political settlement, to create something like a big tent consensual form of politics that could at least help create a foundation for South Sudan before it started perhaps the sort of power competition we've seen. But I think kind of this very simplistic state building approach and the degree to which that itself is one of the drivers in what has failed on the nation building side is something that really needs to be interrogated going forward, and also the implications for that in terms of what can be done. I do feel there is a Humpty Dumpty problem, not to be glib about it, but this was obviously a botched state formation, and South Sudan is a much worse place than what it was at independence on those lines, and the difficulty in sort of getting back to even what could have been there, I think, is quite substantial.
Thanks, Alan. Ferry, over to you.
Thanks. I would like to start where Alan stopped with the political elites, and I agree with Brian's and Nyagoah's point as well. So South Sudan is run by a predatory elite, political class, and this elite class is instigating violence throughout the entire country. Political power and political influence can be achieved through extreme violence, and the governing elite is intensifying ethnic tension and is trying to gain power, influence, and money through this intensification of violence. And this 2018 peace deal did not address any of these issues, just made it more subtle, made it less visible a bit, much more murkier from a Juba point of view, or from a point of view from the capitals of Western countries. Nevertheless, the basic formula that more violence leads to more power have not changed. And the elite realized that they need to rebrand and rename war to peace and pretend that peace is the order of the day that we have today in South Sudan. And what happened is mostly well known. Large parts of the country remain extremely insecure, warfare going on in a lot of places, simply rebranded as intercommunal violence. Entire counties are facing extreme levels of food insecurity, some famine-like conditions, which is a very nice way to say that there is famine in certain parts of South Sudan. More South Sudanese are in need of humanitarian assistance than ever before, since we are recording this number. Entire groups had been chased away from the land of their forefathers without any possibility of return. What is less well known or less articulated is the amazing scale of class transformation that South Sudan is experiencing. Hundreds of thousands had been transformed from rural, self-dependent farmers or cattle keepers into urban or peri-urban, penniless day laborers. Some in neighboring countries, some in POCs or in former POC camps that returned to the control of the government, even more on the outskirts of major urban centers. entire rural counties are empty or almost empty. If you are driving through South Sudan these days, you can drive hundreds of kilometers without seeing a living soul, just the abandoned villages. In certain cases, these counties are repopulated by new populations who are deemed to be allied to the government. We don't know the numbers, as there was never a census, and the recent talks about an upcoming census are not promising that we will know numbers about this. What we know is, what we experience, and we cannot substantiate it with numbers. But these urbanized day laborers will or already do work on constructions, on petty trade or agriculture farms, and all these businesses are owned or controlled by the members of the very elite that is responsible for this transformation. The very people who chased away the populations are profiteering from this class transformation. The international community must be very careful in designing programs of nation building and state building that Alan mentioned, or how to engage with the political elite when they restart nation building as peace return to the country, so we can restart whatever we abandoned in 2013. And history shows us that it is almost never happens that urbanized populations after a generation return to the lifestyle of their parents, even if security improves to a level that it would be possible. We have to face that South Sudan largely changed forever at a magnitude that was unimaginable, even during the second civil war, the second Sudanese civil war. So South Sudan has one political elite that is predatory. Nevertheless, they have to lead the country as there is no other alternative. This is not about individuals. It is not a question of Salva Kiir. It is not a question of Riek Machar. If they leave and not allowed to compete in an election, it will be all good. It's not about that. It is a structural issue. And the issue of this class transformation of the elites and how power from the civil war was transformed into political power of an independent state that was not taken into account after the CPA independence and these nation and state building projects that Alan mentioned. And I think we can learn from this failure. And I think this is the fundamental failure in South Sudan. It was not the South Sudanese who failed the country. It is the international community that allowed the political elite to fail and abandon the people and make this detachment between the elites and the people possible. So I think I stop here and there are other comments.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ferry. I think we have at least an entire set of PhDs in answering all the things you guys have brought up. I'm particularly interested in both the question of the project of the nation and the project of the state. But I want to go back first because someone has posed a question and ask, wasn't this all inevitable? There's a certain determinism that you could have that said, look, what was the SPLMA? The SPLMA since 1983 has been authoritarian. It's been about capturing resources. It's been predatory in its very sort of effectively DNA as a political organization. Isn't that necessarily what we were going to see when the SPLMA took power, first in 2005 and then in 2011? And I'll pose that first quickly to Alan and then to Brian, Nyagoah, and Ferry.
Sure, great question. Well, I mean, some parts of that were inevitable, and I think most of what is mentioned in that was inevitable. I think you are going to clearly have predatory elites built off of the system that had been built off of, and then on top of that with the level of oil revenue. I think what was not inevitable, although also maybe shouldn't have been so surprising, was the elite infighting and civil war that took place. I think there is a way in which the SPLMA the elites could have made what would have been better for them, I think, honestly, from a positive sum perspective, even those who've held on to power, although that's arguably, but I think there could have been something that looked like a more collusive power rather than this sort of civil war that did end up being so devastating. And then how that evolves over time, I mean, as we all know, almost all political orders that eventually end up being less predatory, started more predatory. And so anyway, so I think it depends what we mean by which parts of what happened to South Sudan were inevitable.
I think when you look at the predation in the SPLM era or SPLA wartime period, one could argue very well that it was inevitable that South Sudan was going to end up the way it did in 2011. Nevertheless, there was also an expectation that the predation of the wartime era was going to be restricted to that area, to that era. There was an expectation that when when things came to be, like when the idea of the nation, the country becoming inevitable, when that time came, there would be processes set in place to mitigate the predation, the state capture. And one can argue that when the state was created, the mechanisms for arresting predation were put in place. What really happened, however, I think, is the focus on building the mechanisms of the state, the state building mechanisms, the focus by both local elites and the international community on that process alone, without looking at the political process itself. There was a lot of focus on the technicalities. Let's set up the structures. Let's set up the legislation. Let's do the civil-military relations thing, everything. So that was set in place. But we inevitably forgot that the technical aspects of state building are actually driven by the political aspects of it. And there was not a lot of pressure and introspection of the political process to ensure that the laws that are put in place are actually implemented, to ensure that the processes for checks and balances are strengthened, that there is funding for these institutions, that when you look at the legislation in South Sudan, most of the pieces of legislation will state what the problem is, and they will state what can be done to arrest the problem, but they actually fall short on spelling out consequences. And so this is where I think the international community and South Sudanese elites failed significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I think much of the devastation we've seen over the last couple of years could have been avoided. But we all know that hindsight is a beautiful thing. When we are looking at things in the moment, things appear differently. And what happened is that I'm not a political scientist. I'm a lawyer, a human rights lawyer. But what happened with the comprehensive peace agreement, which was a unique agreement in itself. But what happened with the CPA is that democracy and this idea that a country will be transformed, all of this was sacrificed at its altar with the main purpose of leading the country towards independence, and then giving the responsibility to what we have called a predatory group. The SPLM itself was birthed out of various political movements that merged, including the Nyanya, the students, I think it was called the Student Liberation Group, led by those of OI, the ABA Liberation Front, all these various movements that then, formed into the SPLM. But even after that, for it to solidify itself as the main challenger to the Sudanese regime, it had to do that by purging itself by the various contestations, by comrades stabbing each other in the backs, and obviously then the 1991 split, which then changed the entire political landscape at that point. So I do think, much of what Brian has said, that that process of an overinvestment in a political class that at the very beginning didn't have a unified strategy at politically transforming the country. So I think the international community glossed over a lot of issues, not only the political complacency and the organizational complacency of the entire SPLM, but also of what the Sudanese regime had done in South Sudan. I think that trauma that the Sudanese government and the underdevelopment and the various war crimes that had been committed during the liberation period had been much glossed over for the sake of independence. So I do think there's a lot that could have been avoided. Yeah.
Yes, thank you all. I agree with everything, and I would like to start where Brian stopped about the. I think the fundamental issue is that the SPLM never won the war. The SPLM never wanted independence. It was never clearly articulated that the SPLM has the goal, or at least John Garang has the goal, to leading the country towards independence. And as Nyagoah said, everything was sacrificed at the altar of creating this state, and then it was driving machine towards that. And there was this agreement, or between the Western donors, that the South Sudanese state can use all the oil money to create peace in the country. recreating the CPA in a smaller levels. I mean, famously, Matip has more soldiers when he signed the Juba Declaration in 2006 than the SPLA when he came back to the fold. And these issues of what happened during the civil war, what happened, and then what Brian said about the mechanisms were set up, but they were empty, and there was no pressure on the South Sudanese government or the Southern government to put in place any of these measures that were set up. And there was a lot of focus on the technical side, and this is what I think is a fundamental issue, is that the nation building projects were imagined that we are writing onto an empty, this is an empty piece of paper. This is South Sudan. We can write on it whatever we want to write. And if we create the institutions, if we copy from somewhere else, we create the institutions, it will be all fine. And then you don't have to focus on the complexities of South Sudan, because this is a brand new start. There is no history. There is nothing. We just create this now. And whenever there was a political question in any of these nation building projects, the international community left it to the South Sudanese. So, for example, if my PhD was on the citizenship office, and I sit in this office from 2012 to 2013, watching the interviews of people being interviewed, and the entire thing was run on Western donor money. It was IOM, it was others, helped with the technique. South Sudan paid a lot for, greedy German companies, but nobody ever asked the South Sudanese state of how do you decide who is South Sudanese. Those questions were left entirely to the South Sudanese, and there was not even an interest of these are fundamental questions that a nation must ask. Who are the South Sudanese? How do you decide? How do you make a procedure that let you at the end towards how you decide who is South Sudanese? Do you sign the ethnicity on the ID card or not? All these questions. These were not us. These were all left to the South Sudanese to decide, and we see what happens to. And I'm not advocating for something like holding hands more. I'm just simply saying that you cannot avoid political questions just by saying that these are technical questions, because the end result will be either catastrophic that we see or will be very murky that we've also seen.
Thank you, Ferry. So I want to go back to where Brian started, and that something that Ferry's also just discussed, which is the question of nationalism. And I remember being in Juba 2008 and 2010 and 2011, and there was a great sense, both among, I think, South Sudanese and the international community, of a nascent South Sudanese nationalism. And I think in a lot of the critical works recently, we've swung totally the other way, right? So if you read John Young's book, and I like John Young's book, but it very much is that there was never a project of South Sudanese nationalism. It was a project of a Dinka elite in the SPLMA. If you read Clément Spinot's recent book, there's much the same claim. And I worry sometimes that we've swung far too much in the other direction, and one sort of forgets all of the energy and discussions that were going on from 2005 to 2010 to 11. So Brian, you started off, and I'm going to ask you first, that in 2005, there was unity in South Sudan. The idea of South Sudan was gelling. So what I think John Young would say to that is there was never an idea of South Sudan. There was always a series of groups. There was always ethnic enclaves, and we've just seen a sort of intensification of the project. So I guess my question to you all is, what was South Sudanese nationalism, and what could it have been? How could it have been done differently, such that if one does have the element of hope that both Alan and Nyagoah responded to in some ways, what could it have been from 2005 on to 2013 such that we didn't get this ethnic balkanization, but we did have the building of a nation state project that wasn't just delegated, as one of our anonymous commentators has mentioned, to NGOs and donors? I'm going to ask Brian, and then Nyagoah, and then Alan, and then Ferry.
Right. So I sort of contest the idea that there's nothing called the South Sudanese nationalism. I think there is. It was nevertheless a reaction to colonialism. Of course, South Sudan itself is a colonial construct. Vis-a-vis the relationship of South Sudanese vis-a-vis the North during the colonial era clearly set them apart. And the idea of South Sudanese nationalism started to gel in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s in the secondary missionary created secondary schools like Loka Secondary School, Rumbek, Lower Palatoka and all that. So there was already a nascent idea of a South Sudan nation, the idea of a nation. It was, of course, a reaction to the impending changes, the end of empire, the idea that independence was around the corner. How are we going to live with the Northerners? Those were questions that actually created a sense of nationalism within the South, the first generation of South Sudanese that went to school in the 1950s, people like my father and others. So there is that idea. So now we can say that the idea itself didn't, if you take nationalism from like take the Turkish nation itself, that's different. We don't have a common creation myth, for instance, that brings us together. It's a conglomeration of different ethnic groups united by this desire of having a state, maybe because of these impending changes, because of the way the northern part of the country had treated the South. So there was a distinct idea that South Sudanese were a distinct group of people. And so there was a nationalism project already afoot among the students at Rumbek and other schools back then. And we see that moving on into the 60s. It needed, the idea of this nationalism within South Sudanese needed to gel together properly. I think it was impeded by the fact that the South and the North were actually brought together. So the Northern elites played the political differences within the South Sudanese to actually bring fragmentation within this nationalism project within the South. I think personally, had the Addis Ababa agreement pulled on for another 10 years or another 20 years, where you had a united South Sudanese a federation entity within the South Sudanese, within the Sudanese state, that idea could have developed further. What has happened, the division of the South Sudan, of Southern Sudan into 3 states, fragmented that project. It deepened the cleavages within the South Sudanese political elites. And when we went to war again in 1983, the nationalism project itself was disoriented. We see when the SPLA was created, the idea is rejuvenated. Nevertheless, it's still there are sections within the South Sudan polity that are apprehensive or suspicious of this, the SPLA leading this project. And so I think when you look at the SPLA itself, the recruitment methods of the SPLA, mostly because of the necessity of the situation at that particular point, where there were significant portions of certain ethnic groups making up the composition of the SPLA, the army, and the way the SPLM behaved, that further also, disintegrated this idea of South Sudanese nationalism. Nevertheless, how tenuous it is, it still exists. What it needed or what it lacked was a proper building, or a proper, bringing together of the different blocks under one rubric. And that has not happened. And the SPLM after 2011 actually failed to sort of embark on a process to develop a nationalism sentiment within the South Sudanese community. But it exists. It's very tenuous. It needs to be built on. And as long as that has not happened, you can see the differences emerging. And the idea of a whole South Sudan will be very, very tenuous as we move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with much Brian has said in that during the liberation period, that struggle, that collective struggle by South Sudanese or Southern groups at that point against this process of Islamicization and Arabization certainly created a shared sense of struggle. I mean, growing up, I knew 2 things. One, that I wasn't Sudanese, and that I knew who I was in terms of what subgroup among the Nuer that I was from. So I knew very clearly growing up that I wasn't Sudanese because there was a shared sense of this historical injustices that the Sudanese government was imposing upon us. But despite this shared struggle, this shared collective struggle that Southerners were going through, because the struggle not only reflected a fight for some sort of geographical area to call home, but it was also a fight for culture and identity and recognition, right? So all this was shared before in the lead up to the CPA, as well as in the lead up to independence. But was this enough to cement a nation, and was it enough to cement a thread throughout all the various 64 ethnic groups that we have in the country? No. Very clear. I think even at the selection of Juba as a capital city, I remember there was growing sentiments from the Bari community against having Juba selected as the state capital. And also other ethnic groups were pushing for it to be taken to other parts of the country. So this was already a problem at the beginning. There were also other issues that may have not been addressed by the CPA that also reflected just how fractured we were from the beginning. You know, issues around the national, a lack of a national land policy. I think Joshua has done a lot of good work around land issues in South Sudan. And this is very well reflected in the various contestations of a land, grazing rights, water points, resources all across the country. And I think even in the lead up to, I think everybody was very quick to vote for Southern referendum. And a lot of people were very quick to ascribe to the idea of citizenship without a proper articulation of what are the duties and obligations of citizens and what is the duty of a government, and especially in terms of building a shared sense of identity and a shared sense of struggle beyond the liberation that has delivered us independence. There's also a point that I want to emphasize, in as much as we talk about how the nation building project was seized and captured by elites. You know, we have to emphasize that independence in the nation building project was a result of the perseverance of majority of the Southern populations, that it wasn't just the SPLM that delivered independence or that delivered the CPA, right? It was, you know, the perseverance and the participation of various ethnic groups, and also that were also preyed on. So I think I'll end it there.
Thanks, Nyagoah. Alan?
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. Yeah, and I won't repeat the history mentioned by the previous panelists, but I think it's a good question to raise, and I think, and I also share the concern that sometimes it gets a bit overstated by a lot, I suppose, that there is no such thing as South Sudanese nationalism. Obviously, there is South Sudanese nationalism as a historical project that exists in some form and through certain individuals, and I think also just as a shared common political experience. I mean, I think that's obviously, you can say that there is something like a community of South Sudanese who all, you know, from different sides have very similar shared experiences that creates a bit of an identity. I think it's just not simple. It's just the South Sudanese nationalism doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's also strong ethnic nationalism at various times in different groups, and those two, of course, overlap, and sometimes they don't necessarily have to work at odds against each other, but at times they can, and oftentimes lately they do. And I think the political structure and the broader politics matters. I think obviously in terms of the nationalist project, which I think will continue and is ongoing and goes back a very long ways, as Brian mentioned, that's far from over, but it definitely needs a common political agenda. It needs something, not just the shared experience, but needs something that makes South Sudanese feel like they're working on a common project. And I think that's obviously been missing since independence, and that is partly a failure of politics. But I will say, I think there's also just something in here in which the way in which power is mobilized in South Sudan and the way that overlaps with the ethno-national identities and the way in which the political structure that was created basically made almost all groups in South Sudan feel insecure. It's a really remarkable sort of sense you get, especially when you're talking about the lead up in 2013, the degree to which a lot of the elites basically felt insecure, and the way that sort of drove the mobilization that did occur, and then the way that that worked at odds to something that would have been necessary to create a something that looked more like a national agenda. I mean, nationalism is a project. It can, and it's not linear, and it can go forward and it can regress. But I do think, again, this goes back to my original point, the degree to which the way the state building and state formation went about, and the way that that undermined the nation, the nationalist project, even though they were thought to be complementary. I still think a lot sort of goes back to that.
Yeah, I copied the link. It's a picture from the Anyanya War. It's a poster from 1960 something. It says "Nuer Dinka Moro Acholi Latuko Didinga, one people, one struggle, Anyanya." Just to reflect on what Brian said about the history of Southern nationalism, and that the core was there. And I agree with Brian, with Alan, that it is infused and in talk with ethnic nationalism. And I mean, what is the definition of nationalism? It's basically bringing the borders of the political constituency, matching the borders, the international borders or the administrative borders of the the geographical borders, and creating some kind of imagined community within these borders. And what is remarkable to me in South Sudan is that how in current South Sudan is that how groups are very determined and smart and quick to react and call for the creation of their own ethnic enclaves and own ethnic groups. This is a fragmentation of politics, and this is obviously something that we are not happy to see that is going on in South Sudan. But the way it is done is very, very smart. It is very, it's amazingly quick. It's very smart. It is reacting to situations. And of course, what we see at the end of the day, it's a fragmentation. Each and every ethnic group would like to have its own little territory. But the very core idea that there should be cliques that are governing themselves is basically a way, it's an ethnic nationalism. So the goal for the political community should be that there should be a common agenda that Alan mentioned that should bring together these people, and this very creativity should be used in that way, to bring the country forward and not fragmenting the country. Of course, this is very easy to say and much harder to do, but that would be the way.
Thanks, Ferry. Can I encourage our audience to post questions in the Q&A if you would like your questions answered? And if panelists want to sort of come back to any of the things the other panelists have said, just raise your hands. I wanted to sort of, one of the main takeaways from what you all were saying was that nationalism is not a project that you can think about outside of the logic of state building. And it seems like one of the tragedies you're all talking about is that the actual project of nationalism was itself destroyed in some ways by the very project of state building. And these two things ran against each other. So then, as we've talked about nationalism to come onto state building, what was this state building project? What's happened since 2005 and then again since 2011 that's led to this centralized state, which has actually encouraged ethnic factionalization, winner takes all, the ambiguity of and sort of insecurity of the elites? Why was it created? How was it created? And what does one do about it? And I'm going to pick on Alan to give us simple answers to those questions first, and then go to Nyagoah, and then Brian, and then Ferry.
Wow. I think, there are many state building processes that took place. I'd have a more coherent answer for you if I was not the first. But no, I think there was, there was the public facing, I think internationally sort of driven technical state building process that involved a lot of young foreign graduates, a lot of consultants embedded in ministries in which the project was seen literally as capacity building. As much as that's become a sort of dirty term, I think it's accurate as terms of what the objective was, which was that you help build the institutions, and then with those institutions, you could start to build a state. I think that state building project took place. I think this was sort of ambiguously linked to the nation building project, just not very clearly done so. I think there's a sense that you build a central state and it starts to provide services to its people, and then that starts to provide a national identity, and then everything sort of links hand in hand and you're along sort of road. Again, I just think that wasn't very closely interrogated in terms of the actual power dialectics that basically occurred in that, which is instead you had the political economy get highly centralized and get, you can call it captured. And then that created a dynamic in which it just became, instead of a common project, it just became a sort of winner take all or nothing sort of power struggle. And, that just overran what was the technical state building process. And I think in many ways, and I think, anyways, I think a lot of the technical state building process was a cover, for a lot of the rest, and even accentuated and assisted what became, the sort of de facto state building, which was essentially a centralization of the political economy in one place, and then the sort of power struggle. And I think the sort of way in which the technical process reinforced, even though it was seen as counter, but the way that it often reinforced and provided cover for the more informal consolidation of power, and I think also took away perhaps. I said this recently. And I'll wrap up here soon. But I do think there was a way in which the way it happened. In some ways, the South Sudanese elite were able to wash their hands. They were provided so much technical support. There was a sense. I said recently when I talked to South Sudanese elite that they thought someone knew how to build a country. And I think there was a sort of glib way that they went about the power politics, because the state building part was seen as a sort of technical process, and the degree to which they did really need a common political agenda in order to move the country forward, at least at the beginning. I think that was very much lost, and the external sort of way that was handled, and also just the naivete and confidence that was there from the international side that there was a roadmap that a country can follow to reach these goals. I think is partly responsible for how we ended up here.
I was struggling with my cursor there. So how did we get here? Without having to go through what Alan just described. I mean, I think much of where we are is because there wasn't an investment in building the basic tenets of governance themselves. It was taking what had once been a guerrilla movement and a lot of savvy political actors, and this umbrella politics of bringing in various military and political leaders to unify into a government that is, as Alan says, supposed to provide a roadmap on the way forward, this nation building and state building projects. So from the beginning, there was a lack of investment in institutions that would be able to negotiate, peace, either between political leaders or political parties, or even be able to address independently the various problems, not only within the SPLM as a party, but also the government that is being run by the SPLM. There's also the fact that, so much of the power was centralized. Much of the problem lies with how the constitution was drawn up. Much of the constitution building project at that point focused on ensuring that South Sudan could protect itself from Sudan or from the political influence of its neighbors, and therefore sought to centralize power within the presidency and within a few executives. And this was a huge problem, because we have seen how over time, then this has led into a disenfranchisement a weakening of institutions that are supposed to be independent and strong by the executive. There's also the fact that much of the power has been centralized in Juba, and the periphery is left disenfranchised. 10 years ago and even today, when you go into the peripheries, you go into the states, into the villages, into the payams, government is virtually absent in people's lives. Absent in form of not only social delivery and development, but presence in itself. Much of authority in these areas is left to traditional authorities and chiefs. And over time, the authority and powers of traditional chiefs has been eroded by the statutory system. So this also had a role into how into the political disenfranchisement, and how it also led into this this collapse and this failure that is certainly being felt today.
Is it my turn, Alan? Or...
It's your turn, Brian.
Well, a complicated question. Certainly, I think when I reflect on the centralization of power in the SPLA, in South Sudan after independence, you can see the merit of doing that. First of all, you know, the social fabric. I mean, when you look at the idea of South Sudan as a nation, is very weak. So if you had a strong central power that had altruistic motives to actually build the state, there would be no problem in that. What you had was a centralized power led by individuals who had no state nation building project. Okay, and so what one would have expected is the diffusion of government authority through things like linking the country together. South Sudanese don't even know themselves. So there is a need to link the countries together. And how do you do that? You need projects that link people together. One, you need roads. You need air connections between towns and cities and whatever. That did not happen. You need education. The government needs to have been providing education. A common, one way of nation building is having a common curricula. Like, what is the idea of a nation can be expressed in the school curricula. You did not have that. It was only recently that a national curriculum was actually formulated. So you can see where the rain started to beat the South Sudanese along this path. When we talk of centralized state, we're not only talking of power, we're also talking of effective institutions, effective mechanisms for checks and balances. No one actually also paid any attention to that. When you look at the raft of legislation in South Sudan, there are so many shortcomings, so many gaps that need to be plugged. They were not very apparent in 2011, 2012. Myself, I did not have the kind of critical introspection or lens to look at those pieces of legislation. 10 years later, looking at those pieces of legislation, you can see where the problems are. And also, there was need to educate the workforce on what nationalism is and what it entails to actually follow the legislation. So that did not happen, and because of that, of course, the predatory activities of the SPLM commanders, who had now been transformed into politicians, came into play, and literally what you see is state capture, corruption, on a level that is unprecedented. I mean, you can see, for instance, the Auditor General of South Sudan has not released any audits of the government of South Sudan as stipulated by the Constitution since 2012. And up to today, no one, as far as I know, has ever seen an audit of the government, of government business, a complete audit of government business of independent South Sudan. What you have on record right now, they are available on the Auditor General's website, are audit reports for the pre-independent government of South Sudan. So somewhere along the way, egregious corruption began to manifest itself, and someone wasn't too impressed that the Auditor General's reports were going to be outing them. And so these are things that need to be taken into perspective as we move forward and correct course. There's also the issue of like security sector reform. One way of actually building a state is through the army, ensuring that there is equitable representation of all ethnic groups in the army. The army has to see itself with, the country's ethnicities have to see themselves reflected in in the army. Today, when you see the exposés of who's who in the hierarchy of the military in South Sudan, it is a reflection of only one or two ethnic groups. And as we move forward right now, that phenomena is going to be replicated. The peace agreement actually is supporting that process. So we're going to have two ethnicities overrepresented in the South Sudanese army, and the idea of nation building along that front is still going to be a problem. And so there's a lot of things that we can talk about, but let me give the chance to other people too.
And just very briefly, when I first landed in South Sudan just after independence, I had two meetings, or like I met two people randomly. One was Jok Madu Jok, who was at the time Secretary for Culture in the Ministry of Culture. And when I went to his room, the first time I met him, he had like several scales of buildings that he imagined that these will be the National Museum, you know, the building of the National Museum. And he had big projects of how there will be a collection of artifacts and songs and everything all across South Sudan. And he was desperate of finding money for this. It was not a big project. It was several $100,000, you know, that's something that, you know, that was easily spent on a day in security sector reform in South Sudan. And he was unable to find any grants, any money for this. He had another project, which was a national monument somewhere in South Sudan, remembering the struggle. He was unable to find funding for any of these things. So that's where nation building and state building, you know, went far away. Nobody, you know, put a penny on forging some kind of coherence and, you know, creating these kind of institutions, not just the technical and political institutions. And the other meeting that I had the very same week was with somebody from IOM. She just landed. She was from Japan, and they were moving. They were providing technical assistance to the customer. I think the customer or the border management unit, and they were bringing, I'm not kidding, hundreds of computers to each and every international border of South Sudan, and most of these borders had no electricity. So they were basically flying in equipment to places it could not be used because there was no electricity in these border posts. So they were just like putting these computers that they will wait till the electricity will come there, or install generators, which was another project. To me, it was amazing. You know, on one hand, you are spending millions of dollars on something that will either be taken home immediately or will never be used. And then this other guy who is returning from the US is unable to gather a few $100,000 to create a national museum. And of course, you can say that creation of a national museum might be, you know, the task of the state. And you know, I might stop here because I see Brian would like to say something to this.
Yes, when we talk of the state building project regarding the museums, you really need a museum to bring you know, to memorialize you know, what had happened in the past, and also to give you a sense of nationalism and a sense of like, this is what happened in the past and we need to go forward. We on various fora, some of us have advocated for that, hoping that it will fall on the ears of the decision makers. To date, that has not happened. For instance, a museum, a war museum, would be that start, for instance. And one location where it could be placed is at the foot of the Jebel Kujur, where the old Sudan Army firing range was. And why? Because that was the spot where they some of the Torit mutineers who gave themselves up, who were deceived to give themselves up, were fire squatted. You know, you could have a plaque there that says, hey, on this spot, Sergeant Ronaldo and others were executed by, you know, by the state for this and that. There are so many things. You could retrieve the Land Rover where John Garang, which John Garang used to escape from Bor, is rotting. The skeleton is rotting somewhere. You could retrieve that. Salva Kiir's Land Rover, which he used to escape from Bor, was pushed into the River Nile around Doleb Hill. That could be retrieved and placed in there, and many other things. So the nation building project did not happen along that front. I think also, you know, when we talk of how that could have also happened, you know, there needs to be a deliberate process within the political parties. That takes into consideration the fact that there is a previous fragmentation along ethnic and regional lines. So the party selection, for instance, if you have the SPLM selecting one person and saying, you know, this person is going to be like, the accusation right now is that the power has been concentrated among the Dinka. Let's say the SPLM, for instance, says our next candidate is going to be Anwer, and that person is going to serve for 4 years. There's a term limit, 4 years. Whatever the constitution says, the constitution may say a president may serve 2 terms, but the party itself limits the participation of its candidate for one term. And you pull, after 1 term, when the elections are coming up again, you pull that person out and you bring another person. So a rotational leadership that kind of brings everybody into, so that everybody feels that they're are represented. I'm not saying this is perfect. This is really a very rough, tenuous idea, but I hope you get the point. There has to be a deliberate process to sort of bring people together politically. In the long run, when this happens, maybe for 10 or 15 years, and I got this idea. I was speaking to someone who is propagating this idea. You could break the idea or the notion in people's minds that tribe or ethnicity or regional is important, so that next time what you really have is, you know, politics driven by a party agenda rather than, you know, people seeing ethnicity or regionalism in it.
Great. Alan, you had your hand up next, so it's over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Just quickly reflecting a bit more. I mean, I think when it comes to state building, and this has been brought up by several others, the degree to which constitutionalism and the degree to which a sort of cookie cutter political system was put on South Sudan, I think is a really important component about what went wrong and just how ill-suited the current political system sort of fits within what is, you know, what South Sudan actually is politically is really important. I mean, some of this can get kind of abstract when it comes to state building and nation building, but South Sudan was obviously a place that it really did require basically elite consensus among the top elites. There would be a capacity for a long time for groups who wanted to basically mobilize people and rebel against the state, and the state was going to have extremely limited capacity to basically coercively hold this together. And that's just not the sort of political system that was even thought about forging. And I don't think there was much thought put into it. There was a lot of just copy and pasting that went on, rather than something that looks like a constitution that would be a negotiated settlement among communities, which is when it happens organically in places much more what it looks like. So I think that not only the technical sort of building of roads, but also the designing of a political system from not only the top down, but sort of almost externally in, and the way that overlaps with what in actual political systems that's being forged by the actual elite looks like, and that those are working often against each other rather than in conjunction. But I think this sort of constitutionalism and how that interplayed as a technical process rather than a political one is an important part of this whole state building dynamic.
Thank you, Alan. If I could ask Christopher to unmute Nyagoah, as her cursor's frozen and her hand was up, so you couldn't see it before Ferry's. I testified, Ferry, to that effect. And then Nyagoah can go first. There is technical wizardry happening as we speak, possibly. Christopher's smiling, which is a good sign. No.
So I'll work on that, and just give me a moment here.
Say again?
Just give me a moment. I'll try to figure this out.
All right, Ferry, if you want to go first, and then we'll come back to Nyagoah. Sorry,
Nyagoah. Just getting back what Brian said. Yes, to everything you said about the museums and other stuff. But you cannot do it without taking into account what happened between Southern Sudanese communities. And it was not, mostly it was not against the Northerners. It was intra-South Sudan stuff. So you have to deal with issues like the Bor massacre. You have to deal with issues like what happened in Wau in the 90s, all these issues. And I think there, I mean, we were very pessimistic, I think, in this panel, but there were, for example, I was amazed by some parts of the national dialogue, that they were able to bring together people. They were really vocal. They were really, expressing opinions. Of course, later on the higher levels, politics came in and they tried to withhold the resolutions and everything. But the process itself, showed me that I have optimism. South Sudanese are very, it was a very encouraging process. Alan, on your point on the constitution, I've seen the white paper on constitution drafting, which was done by some kind of international lawyers working for the South Sudanese state. In several places, it had Fiji in the document because it was copy pasted from the Fiji one, and there was 80-something pages long document that had Fiji at least 7 times left in it, because I guess they worked on one night when they changed Fiji to South Sudan. So I stop here. Maybe we can solve the issue with.
Christopher, update from the Technical Wizardry School.
No, I don't have an option here to fix the microphone or the audio for Nyagoah. It's simply a prompt to ask her to unmute.
But I believe her cursor's frozen.
Maybe Nyagoah need to leave and come back. Is it that option?
Yeah, that could be.
Brian, do you have another point as your hand is raised, or is that an old phantom hand?
That was an old one.
Okay. Well, while we still work on this, I might pass to the next question because I'm not sure what to do technically. So one of the questions I wanted to address from the Q&A is one that's repeatedly circled around international diplomats who've been asking me questions. I don't know why they do that, but they persist in doing so, which is, what difference does personality make? And just so I'm not going to ambush you, this is going to go first to Ferry, then to Alan, then to Brian, then to Nyagoah. So one of I'm just summarizing a question that's in the Q&A. One of the positions I've heard a lot from diplomats is the problem is here in Mashar. The problem is a generation of politicians who came up during the SPLMA and its divisions and its fragments. And what we need to do effectively is get rid of those politicians. One of the questioners, one of our anonymous attendees, expresses it rather succinctly by suggesting that a way forward may be a coup d'etat Jerry Rawlings style, and what he did in Ghana. I'll leave out the rest of that quotation. So is the problem personalities? And if it is, in what sense is it a problem of personalities? And if it's not, why is it not a problem of personalities? And why will things not be solved simply by moving on the extant political class?
So I started, you told me. I think I started with this. I don't think this is a problem of personalities. I think it's a structure issue. And I also think that personally, I find both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar fascinating persons. They are able to keep top of their game and be in power for, what is it now, 20, almost 30 years. They really know what they are doing. They are very smart people, very good politicians, and how do you do that technically? How do you exclude people from political power? This is the political elite that is in South Sudan, and I think the international community has to work with the political elite who's in South Sudan. But I'm not a political scientist, so I leave this question to Alan and Brian. They have more to say on that. But I just want to say that I'm really fascinated by these two persons, how smart they play their game.
Sure, I'm not sure I'm a political scientist either, but listen, I mean, this is obviously a structural issue in South Sudan. It's I think it's not only a structural issue. I mean, I think you can definitely point out, I think leadership does matter to a degree, and I think you can point out leadership traits that, for instance, Kiir has, and also just even just the ability to sort of sell some of these projects internally and externally, and how that matters. I think it does. But I think to your more fundamental point about whether or not this would be solved with a generational issue, a new generation coming in. I mean, I appreciate the optimism that's embedded in sort of hoping that a new generation can sort of solve this. I do think a new attitude, the potential of a new attitude could, is sort of necessary. It is hard to see how South Sudan sort of moves forward in a positive direction if you don't have someone who's willing to think a bit more positive sum instead of zero sum. But I think South Sudan's challenges are just extremely great, unless no matter who is leading it. And I think the sort of political incentives for this sort of zero sum tactical politics are obviously embedded there. It's one of the reasons that we've focused a lot on the political system, because I just think the actual political system that South Sudan has ended up adopting and evolving towards just creates really terrible incentives for the elite that sort of accentuate the sort of conflicts that we've seen. So I think I think the structural issues there, the degree to which when a country without roads that are so heavily armed, with a centralized political economy, and with the history of divisions that it has, it's just going to take a really long time, and the incentives are not positive if this is a winner-take-all system.
Is it a structural or leadership or personality issue? I'm a great believer in institutions. So I think there is a big structural issue in South Sudan that has contributed to its numerous problems. Nevertheless, I recognize also that even if you have a structure, if you have mechanisms, you need humans to drive the change that those mechanisms are supposed to bring forward. And when I look at the personality of the leaders that we have right now in South Sudan, I do not think that they have it within themselves to actually make sure that the structures in the country work for the betterment of the population of South Sudan. And I can see that I'm looking back at like 10 years record, things that should have been addressed already. I mean, like, for instance, that corruption is an issue. Well, the Anti-Corruption Commission is complaining that it doesn't have the funds to do its work. There are 2 pieces of incompatible legislation governing the work of the Anti-Corruption Commission and stymieing its effectiveness. Therefore, here, there is a structural issue here. It needs a human being. It needs some political decision making to actually ensure that this structure works. And when I look at South Sudan and I look at the personalities of the leaders that we have, they don't have that resolve to actually ensure that the structures work. Nevertheless, I'm still a big believer in ensuring that we South Sudanese follow a culture of adhering to institutionalism. All right. And in that regard, there's a suggestion here that you need a military coup. I think a military coup at this particular point would be a disaster for the future of South Sudan, and for the precedents it will set for impunity. So the utmost effort needs to be exerted on ensuring that you have structures, and those structures not only from within the government, within the political parties. Those structures need to be strengthened to ensure that leaders are held accountable. The erosion of South Sudan is also a manifestation of the erosion of the internal structures of the SPLM and the impunity that followed. So it has to be a complementary process, one on the political level within the political parties and also within government itself as a structure. Thank you.
Nyagoah, do we have sound now? Yeah.
Yes, we do. Thank you all for bearing with me. I was going to point at a point that was made before my audio went off, this question about memorialization and it being and museums and truth and history being an important part of nation building. But you can't have memorialization without this process of truth telling. You can't have that also without accountability. So when we think back about all, if we're thinking 2005 and any time before that, then it's reckoning with the injustices perpetrated by the Sudanese governments, as well as of the various Southern movements. Because how do you arrive at an accurate history without actually doing the groundwork of introspecting and finding, and fact finding? It's also the same with, the 2013 to the present. I know that is not the much of our conversation. And when we reflect about, what is where we are at today. So you've had since 2011 a government that has, has taken power from the population, that has preyed on its population and on the citizens. So you do have what, on the one hand, a sense of complacency by government officials, the inability to do anything to move or progress South Sudan ahead. But at the same time, you have that being met by the apathy of citizens, the apathy because one, criticism and any form of criticism is met with brute force, either by the National Security Service or the army. This has definitely been the case since 2011. The targeting of political activists, even international members of international organizations. So you have that general apathy that has arisen by South Sudanese knowing that when you speak up too much, you're going to get into trouble. And so then you have a population of really either one, not well informed on what's happening in government, unless you are, an intellectual or members of the elite, and even then the information you're receiving might be biased. And then you have a population that just doesn't care or is afraid to actually care. But how do we move forward? So institutions, we have spoken a lot. Need for institutions. We just published today a report that focuses on just how lacking the judicial infrastructure and the legal and the law enforcement infrastructure is in the states and in people's lives. And then people take rule of law into their own hands because there's no investment in the judiciary, no investment in the police. There has been an overinvestment in the army. Then you have the aspects of you have militarized governors who are taking the leadership of what should be of technocrats, right? Of individuals who are actually able to run the day-to-day business of the government, other than taking things by might. So I feel as if we have reversed to a certain state of nature. But the way to move ahead, I believe, is in investing in independent, strong institutions of governance.
Thank you, Nyagoah. Alan, you want to come back to that? Alan, you're on mute.
Yeah, no, it's just to say that, I mean, I think leadership and the degree to which personality drives this is overstated, but I do think we can overstate it the other way. I mean, I do think obviously leadership matters. I think, we can take other countries and the sort of political transitions and what happens when leaders change as examples, that leaders do actually matter and who their constituents are and their leadership style. And so I also think there's a part with the current leadership where, they are bound by their structure, but there's a lot of baggage, and I think they're sort of known quantities, So I think when the question comes up of what other leaders could look like, I think we shouldn't be too necessarily deterministic about it. It does matter some.
Thus speaks ICG. So I want to get on soon to what we're going to do in the future. But first, I'm going to bow to the weight of the Q&A, which is all about the international community. So advance warning to you guys, I'm going to go to Nyagoah first, and then Ferry, and then Brian, and then Alan. So far today, I've just heard a lot of criticism of the international community. We can enumerate some of those, that it's been in the 2005 agreement and in the state building process, too technocratic, too uninterested in the actual political economy, too formalistic. Then, according to Ferry, in the ARCSS and the ARCSS, it's effectively rewarded military power. The whole process is designed to sort of create a centralized political economy, which has created ethnic factionalization. If all of these things are true, one of the questions from our anonymous attendees is, has the international community learned its lessons from these errors? And if it hasn't learned these lessons, why has it not learned these lessons? So one of our anonymous attendees has referred to Alan's favorite line about South Sudan being Humpty Dumpty. One variant of that would be, why does the international community consist in performing the same mistakes and the same errors, and what's at stake in that? And because I'm not personally a negative person, I want to add to that question. So what should the international community be doing? I'm just going to quote from an autonomous ND. What are the initiatives and actors that make you hopeful at an internal and external level? Given the opportunism of the elites, how should the international community cooperate with people in South Sudan, and how? So take some, none, or any of those questions as you like, and feel free, of course, to raise your hands and jump on what other people are saying, and I will lead off with Nyagoah.
Right, several questions, and I think several considerations to it. Has the international community learned its lessons in South Sudan? I think yes and no. I'll start with the no part. The know that at what point should they have learned at what point were they supposed to learn the lesson, or to condense the various mistakes they have made in South Sudan since 2005 going forward? And I would say no, in that they sort of replicated this lack of transformation in South Sudan, with the various peace deals that have been signed. The 2015 peace agreement definitely did that. The 2018 peace agreement also does not offer an option for total transformation. Well, there's the option of elections, but there's a lot of considerations to be made in what will be the outcome of the next elections in South Sudan, and will the outcome actually lead to democracy and total political transformation in the country? Yes, in that over time, no, also because we're still seeing a lack of strong approaches or strong action being taken on South Sudan. I would say yes, because in some ways we have seen since the signing of the peace deal, the international community hasn't poured in money like they used to before. They've definitely learned the lessons in that money will be siphoned off into private coffers, or that the projects that are set out to be accomplished will not be accomplished. So with regard to the funding sector, we have seen some change and some caution being played by members of the international community. But still, we're not seeing the very strong action that should be taken, in that the peace deal implementation has taken almost 3 years now, and we're still not seeing any form of leadership either from the African Union or IGAD, and as well as the broader international community themselves. It's all just free flowing at this point, and the government is left at will to do what it will at the very pace that it wishes. I'll jump onto the question, the issue about optimism. Yeah, I think there is a lot to be optimistic for. I read an article yesterday that kind of emphasized something about the kind of space we work. I would say, in that much of the failures and the shortcomings of South Sudan have been documented, but the various citizen-led efforts that are giving the country hope are not, right? So there are people that are at work to ensure that that we don't go the route that we started going on in 2013. There is hope. I would say, in that we're starting to see more and more people speaking up against the kind of political rot that the country is suffering. The national dialogue is a perfect example of citizens really speaking up and expressing their views about where they want the country to go. Obviously, there are questions over how that process has been guided, but there is optimism, I would say, where to draw it from. At the end of the day, I think there is a lot to be hopeful for, in that South Sudanese are becoming much more aware that the status quo cannot persist and something needs to change.
Yeah, I agree with Nyagoah, and I think there are a lot of things that the international community learned. And I don't have the numbers, but it also, you know, coincides with the fact that there's much less money now to spend on South Sudan than it was in 2013 or 11 or 2012. But for example, that the entire security sector reform following the RRCSS since 2018 is basically run without any external funding is amazing too. And that's one of the reasons why nothing happened on the ground. So I mean, it's a complete shift, and what I've seen is that there's this amazing shift from the international community that okay, they funded state building, now they don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to give a penny to anything that has connection to the state, and you know that's like you know that's again going to the completely other side, because that's for example, Brian mentioned the case of the anti-corruption office. They are one of the guys who are not getting any projects running because nobody is funding the state, and they are seen as part of the state and not getting funding. About optimism, yes, there are things to be optimistic. There are 8 South Sudanese athletes at the Olympics, and 6 of them are from the international refugee team, which means that much more people have chances if they are refugees, and these people, I guess, at one point would like to return to their country of origin. And hopefully, you know, these people will have skills and education, and we will see what will happen. I mean, we know that quite a lot of good things happened after the CPA when people returned from exile. Some of them later went back, some remained. So, you know, I have some optimism about that in South Sudan.
So when political elites in South Sudan speak of lack of local ownership on things like the peace agreement, we have to be wary of statements like that, because in their mind, when they talk about such things, they have the winner takes all perspective. And basically, when they condemn the international community on imposing peace agreements on others, it's because they were prevented from having their way, which would have been also disastrous. So we got to take that with a pinch of salt whenever we hear statements like that. What has the international community learned? I think there are lessons as enumerated by the speakers before me. I don't want to delve into that, but I'll give you a good example. Recently, the IMF has started giving money to South Sudan, and there are very stringent conditions on how that money should be used, including, of course, an independent audit of how that money has been spent. And South Sudan has been out of the fray for a while, and you know, isolated sort of as a pariah. And the allocation of the IMF funds was a signal to the leadership of the country that somehow we're coming back, we're being brought back into the fold of the international community. But there are these conditions. And the way I understand is that there's a lot of talk about adhering to the stipulations put forth by the IMF. So in that regard, I think that's a good example of what the international community has learned. It needs to be replicated you know, in grand scale, basically. One of the things that I think the international community still needs to learn, I think, is you know, with regard, you know, they've said, okay, we really don't want to interfere so much. We want to pull out a bit and leave you to your own devices. And you know, even with the peace agreement, the international community was not, you know, really forcing the hand of a lot of people there. It was just very tenuous. And then what it did was, you know, it realized the agreement was signed, but then it kind of pulled off and left the actors to their own devices in terms of implementing the agreement. I think there needs to be an international hand in ensuring that actually the tenets of the peace agreement are implemented to the letter. And one of the shortcomings of this agreement, if you look at it, is that it doesn't really create any consequences on individuals or entities that do nothing to implement the peace agreement. So that's problematic. When we look at optimism, I think that a lot of South Sudanese now are aware about what has happened and what needs to be happening. You're hearing these conversations. You've heard them in the national dialogue. almost entirely. If you ever speak to anyone in the SPLM, from the top leadership to the bottom, all of them are agreed that something bad has happened and that a change needs to happen. And they are not shy of pointing the finger at the leadership of the country. But they can't speak that, in public. They can't say that. They will say that. You've seen articles from on Sudan Tribune and other publications from individuals that you wouldn't even think they would raise their voice to criticize the malfeasance happening in the country, but it's happening. So that, I think, gives a sense of optimism. And I think even within the political leadership, despite their winner-takes-all attitude and their shortcomings and their greed for power and predation and all that, they also realize that there's something that has happened, and that a change needs to occur if South Sudan is to move forward. Thank you.
I suppose it's my turn now. I'm optimistic South Sudanese can negotiate, in theory, a political system that works better for South Sudan, and a system that, that just works better and makes more sense for the country. I think it would be absurd to sort of say otherwise. I think the obvious challenge is it's hard to get from point A to point B when the established powers don't see major incentive to allow that to happen. So I do think the political economy is a significant barrier to this entire thing. I think you could look maybe at the declining of the oil revenue as not only a clear threat, but also something that could be an opportunity for South Sudan, in as much as it could rejig what has proven a very toxic centralized top-down political economy. But I think, that doesn't sound terribly optimistic either. But I do think it is possible. It's just hard to get from point A to point B. In terms of internationals, no, I don't think they've learned their lesson, but I'm not sure what that lesson would be for them to learn. I don't think there's a ton of ways of positive. I think it's not that there's many magical silver bullets for externals to sort of make these processes happen. I think a lot of what externals end up getting into are are basically ways of doing less harm. Is often, I feel like, a lot of the work that I end up in terms of doing. I also just think, honestly, we just, if you're cycling people in for 1 or 2 year stretches, it's just impossible to sort of get through the liberal grab bag of jargons of democracy and peace deals, et cetera, and sort of get through to what South Sudanese politics actually is, and get to something that looks much more like supporting a South Sudanese political process. And I just don't think that's what the international community is even really trying to do. So I don't think they're going to do it. I think they've learned some lessons about, their original plans not really working. I just don't think they have a alternative state building sort of model. I think it's sort of a one-trick pony.
Thanks, Alan. Nyagoah, did you have a point? Because you had your hand raised earlier, but it has now vanished.
Yeah, it was on the IMF loan that Brian had raised. I mean, yes, it had a couple of strict reporting issues, but at the same time, I feel that loan was given without certain conditions being met by South Sudan. It was also really sad that much of the loan, much of the November 2020 loan went to pay the army and NSS salaries. So basically, it's the IMF financing abuses in South Sudan, I would say. It doesn't make sense that a lot of these loans should then be used in place of social protection in South Sudan. But I'm not an economist.
Okay, great. We're coming towards the last wrap-up question I'm going to pose to everyone, which you'll be able to see in your chat boxes. But I want to make sure we get through all of the Q&A questions. So just coming back to something Alan mentioned, one of our questions from our anonymous attendees is, okay, maybe the oil is running out in South Sudan. One could see that as an absolute catastrophe insofar as the wealth that's funding the elite and the redistribution of power and wealth among the elite is running out. Or one could see that slightly paradoxically, as very hopeful, because no longer will the elite receive external resources, but will have to forge a new social compact with the people. Those obviously are two extremes, but do any of you have a take? Do any of you fall on one side or another? And rather than everyone speaking, if you just raise your hand, if you do have a response to that question. Brian, you're first up.
I think the fact that the oil is going to run out at some point has been very clear from way back in 2012. I think that you know, the leadership knows that, and I think that when we talk of other revenue streams, it is not outside the realm of possibility to raise that money from our other sources. We have seen that when there is a diligent leadership at the helm of any revenue collection mechanisms in South Sudan, something happens. Recently, when there was this fellow from Ghana who was, excuse me, I got.
Ferry, would you like to take over?
Yeah, just what Brian mentioned, and I think it's already going on. When you've seen the setup of the local governments in all 10 states, one of the critical issues that the SPLA-IO and the SPLA-IG were like really struggling with is who controls not just the Minister of Finances locally, but the very person who is in charge of collection of revenue, because that's basically now the income that the state governments are having. And I think we will see more of that down to the county and Payam levels. That was my point, that this is already going on. Back to Brian.
Yeah, so when you have capable individuals at the helm, you could actually raise revenue. We've seen that. But the problem here then is you know, the issue of transparency. When we saw that, when we saw a foreigner at the helm of the National Revenue Authority raising significant sums of money and actually publicly saying, this is the amount of money we raised this month and last month, this was not really going very well with people who actually are bent on actually taking those funds. So what we see is the machinations that took place that saw the removal of that person and the placement of a crony to head that revenue collection department, and then the complete disabling of the public process of revealing the amounts of money collected. So you know, I think for me it's a godsend that the oil revenue will run out. However, there has to be certain mechanisms in place to anticipate the complete when those funds actually run out. At the moment, there is no discussion on that. You see tenuous or very sporadic statements about how using agriculture to revive the country, but you see actually no political will or effort, concrete effort devoted to improving the lot of small farmers in South Sudan. And of course, there's so many things that need to be done on that front. You need roads to get the food from the rural areas to urban centers to the borders for export, for instance. And that's not happening. You're happening at the moment. You need efforts in place to ensure to incentivize an increase in food production. And you know, like if you look at farming in South Sudan, subsidiary farming, you know, I traveled on the Juba Road several times, and I saw that, and I said to myself, no wonder that there's going to be insufficient food, because you know there's only so much that one person can do on a farm. So you actually need to be moving into things like you know, mechanized farming, like tractors, community, you know, like cooperatives for tractors to increase production and fertilizers and all that. There is absolutely no talk on how that is going to happen at the moment.
Thank you, Brian. So again, this is not for all of you, but if you want to raise your hands, if you have a response, I want to just address the first question we got by Q&As, which is simply a nice, easy one. What's the future of this peace process? There's been a lot of criticism throughout this session of top-down, elite-driven elite level peace processes driving a lot of the problems we've seen. What's likely to happen to the ARCSS? And if that is as limited and as problematic as we think, what are the other sort of ways forward outside of elite level peace processes? Deathly silence in the room. Brian, go for it.
Yeah, I kind of take to I've heard this statement so many times about the peace process in South Sudan being a very elite-driven process. I've always asked myself, but who's the person who's leading negotiations? Who are the people at the helm? Politics itself, really, power is a very elite process, so to speak. And elites are supposed to represent the views of their constituencies. And so there's this expectation that what the elite says is something that has been channeled from the grassroots. So I don't know where to place that. Regarding the future of this peace process, the future of this peace process is really very tenuous in my opinion. On one hand, there's a lot that needs to be done to ensure that it's implemented. On the other hand, very little has been done to ensure that it's on track. But that little that has been done is actually really surprising to me that it has happened. And that sort of maybe gives me an idea that it might work. It might work, however tenuous the idea is. I think what really needs to happen with this peace agreement is for the entities that have signed it to focus very strongly on Chapter 4 of the provisions of the agreement. And Chapter 4 talks about institutional reform mechanisms, accountability mechanisms. That has to happen very, very quickly. You need a reform, not only a reform, actually, you need an overhaul of the institutions of South Sudan that are supposed to hold government officials accountable. So you need to rethink how the National Audit Chamber works. You need to rethink how the Anti-Corruption Commission works. You need to rethink how Ministry of Finance functions at the Bank of South Sudan. You need to rethink how the legislature works. You actually also have to overhaul all the pieces of legislation to make them stronger, to create consequences. Not only not only state what the problem is, but also spell out mechanisms for errant behavior or addressing errant behavior. We don't see that right now. So where I see a lot of hope for this peace agreement is if there is a focus on Chapter 4. Chapter 4 will address the issues of predatory behavior that were in the first place instrumental in sparking this war. And I think also that we need to have some justice mechanisms in place, reconciliation. South Sudan is a very wounded nation. There are grievances from the past that keep cropping up in the future, in the present, and it will crop up in the future that will undo the whole project of that this peace agreement intends to achieve. So there has to be that. That process, however, has to be very local. It has to be a very local driven process. It has to have the ownership of people in it. I think those two elements are very important. And I think there is need to rethink how the army is going to be. The security sector really needs, there needs to be a rethink of that process as well to ensure that this peace agreement holds. So if I was to make a projection of what the future is, I would say the future of this peace agreement is, I would use terms like troubling, uncertain. There is a little optimism about it, but not, you can't say it's 100%. So that's how I would evaluate this peace agreement. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Alan, your hand was up marginally quicker than Ferry's.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about what the peace deal is and what the peace deal isn't. And I think there's a lot of criticism of the peace deal. And I think, I think oftentimes what looks like the peace deal failing is oftentimes that South Sudan is failing. Power sharing is something that essentially occurs in places where politics has failed, and politics is failing in South Sudan. I think the peace process as it is very limited in as much as it's basically a top line ceasefire. between the top two guys. And I don't need to go into the details about how even that framing is limited itself in terms of, you know, what their camps are and how little they are necessarily fighting each other. I think, though, it does speak to the fact to even have sort of, it does speak to the fact that I think any form of basic stability in South Sudan probably does require just a lot more consensus among elites than what we've seen so far, in the difficulty of forging that. I think the challenge in the peace process is the degree to which it's taken literally as something much more than a truce, much more than a mitigative measure. I think especially around the elections and the sort of hope that this is a transitional sort of roadmap that leads somewhere forward, including through, you know, democratic transformation. I mean, I think that's a point in which maybe some of the ways in which the peace deal, you know, could help reduce the violence at least, and help provide a bit more political space for South Sudanese. Those are the parts where then it gets, you know, a bit more problematic. I think ultimately the roadmap for South Sudan will not be one of these transitional periods. It'll be something that looks like at some point them sitting down and being able to negotiate something that looks like a broad settlement. And that's not, I hope that's not as abstract as it sounds. I think that is sort of something that is possible, and it could be done in the context of parts of this peace deal. But I don't think that's what the peace deal is overall. And I'm not, I think I'm not sure the peace deal is necessarily the giant boogeyman of a lot of this either. I think it's just the state project is not working in South Sudan.
Yeah, just following from there, I also agree with Alan. There is no plan B in town. So I think the peace deal is the one we have to live with, and that South Sudan has to live with. And I agree with Brian that there is surprising elements that have been implemented. But of course, the structure that the peace deal created is unsustainable. I mean, South Sudan has a parliament of 550 members for 12 million people, which is the second highest after North Korea. It's utter craziness to have 550 members of parliament plus 100-member upper chamber and 40-something ministries in each of the 13 administrative units, 10 states and the 3 administrative areas. It creates tens of thousands of professional politicians all across the country, which is obviously unsustainable. And this creates also an amazing level of fragmentation. And this fragmentation is not going against this is something that we discussed a lot with Joshua, that this fragmentation is not against the centralization of power. This fragmentation is empowering the center, because the center can play, both Machar and Salva can play with this fragmentation of staying on top. And what I've seen already with the peace deal is that, for example, on the county and Payam levels, their administrators are not yet implemented or selected, but on the county levels, it creates very, very strong county commissioners, much stronger county commissioners than there were before the civil war. And this is what Nyagoah mentioned. I think she might mention something along that HRV just published about summary executions all across. It was in Lakes and Warrap, but it happened in Tombura as well on the orders of the county commissioner. And these things, can go on without any consequences. And I think that's a major problem in this peace deal, that the local administrators will have much more power, because the removal of them needs a much more, like, it's a very technical thing. It's not just the governor who can fire a county commissioner, but it needs the entire political establishment to move forward. So I stop here.
Yeah, I think much has already been said about how delicate the peace deal is, but I'm going to reflect on the recent interview, a very rare interview that the president gave to a Kenyan journalist on the eve of our independence. And there's a lot we could say about that interview, but what I saw very clearly was a reflection of the trauma that is also, that is not only experienced by majority of South Sudanese populations, but also of clearly leaders themselves. And that in that the president was very critical of his officials at that point. And he was also very clear that there are certain elements of the peace deal that are unimplementable. So I do think that the future of the peace deal rests on the relations between the various government officials and more importantly, the principles in the peace deal. It also rests very heavily on what role the army, whether unified or not, is going to play, as well as what role the National Security Service is going to play in the political process going forward. I think it's also very clear that in what we see, what is the end result of this peace deal? I mean, we could say a lot about the RACS, but it has a very rich reform agenda, right? Much of the focus has been on Chapter 1, which is power sharing, but much of the peace deal has lots of rich issues around. I mean, Brian has already talked about Chapter 4, which is about reconstruction and about institution building. There's Chapter 5, which is on truth-telling, accountability, and justice. I mean, obviously, the government is very wary of accountability processes and are trying to push forward the truth and reconciliation process. But truth and reconciliation process are just as controversial and as difficult as criminal accountability processes. So I do think, the peace deal has a rich reform agenda, but is this transitional government, is this revitalized transitional government of national unity, is its intention to perform this reform agenda, or is its intention to survive until the next point of transition, which is either election or a worse outcome?
Thank you, Nyagoah. So in closing, I wanted to ask all of you to paint me two pictures relatively succinctly, as we don't have very much time. The first is, what do you think South Sudan would be like in 10 years if you were an optimist? And the other is, if you were pessimistic, where do you think South Sudan will be in 10 years? And I'll ask Alan to open us up, and then go to Brian, and then Ferry and Nyagoah, you get to close.
Wow, properly ambushed. In 10 years' time, if I'm an optimist, what I would say is that there was a break at some point in the politics that opened up political space, and that the sort of collective sense among South Sudanese, which is very much real, that Nyagoah talked about earlier, that the sense that there is the status quo is not working, and that there was an opening in the political space such that the elite are able to sort of do what I would call a bit of a reset. And obviously many of South Sudanese problems would remain, but there could be something that looks like a bit more of a political consensus to move the country forward, and with enough of a set of elites who see a positive sum scenario out of that and realize that there's not any other option. I think the path to that would be, is not the path that we're on now, but you could imagine various scenarios where political space opens up. The negative, the pessimist side is of course that things just keep getting more and more grim, that the basic logic that there's no good way of taking power from those who have it in Juba, and that there's no real check on their power in as much as from the grassroots, that basically logic just keeps continuing, and that you see more and more pauperized sort of communities at the local level and an international community that is largely withdrawing, and you just have a really grim sort of city-state almost structure in Juba, and the rest of the country is it doesn't head in a good direction. And I think, I do think both of those scenarios are possible, by the way.
I personally think that the state building is very difficult. The convulsions that have gripped South Sudan in the last 10 years had to happen somehow, and they serve a good lesson on what not to be in 10 years. So I have a rather optimistic viewpoint. I think that in 10 years, there will be a transition, both in terms of the personnel that have been at the helm of the destruction that has happened in the last 10 years. And that transition will create opportunity for a rethink or a reset of what South Sudan should be going forward. And in that regard, there will be there will be a democratic state. It will be tenuous. The situation will not have stabilized completely, but we would have moved away in South Sudan from resolving political issues using the force of weapons.
My point of view, the optimistic one will be my internal anarchist one, so I'm talking about the point of view of the people, of the masses, is that hopefully there will be much less state interference, much less state will be present in the lives of everyday people, especially in the countryside, because the state shows itself in the face of a usually, some kind of armed force. So what I'm hopeful is that people can return to their lives and will be let to live their lives without state interference, and they can live a life without meeting a prime administrator even once in their lifetime. That's the best way possible, and that also includes very minimal interference from NGOs and the UN for people in the countryside. The pessimistic one is very close to Alan's pessimistic one. Is this grim political power struggle goes on, which creates cities that are under control, and basically everything happens in cities, including humanitarian aid distribution, and people flee to cities when there is insecurity in the countryside, or when they would like to access services, and politics remain the same of winner takes all, and they're fighting for these cities. But I'm optimistic about the first one as well. So we have 3 optimists.
Yeah, so the optimistic view, I think in 10 years, I would want to have a much more positive conversation if I am still on this earth. A government that is more invested in social and economic development of its people, that is providing, adequate universal access to healthcare, to education, and that communities all over the country feel that they are empowered and can actually call truth to power and challenge their leaders, and their leaders respond. So a responsive government that is present in people's life, that is actually delivering and is actually delivering on those promises of the liberation and promises of the independence. Pessimistic. I do not want to be pessimistic. So I will not offer a pessimistic view on this one.
Great, thank you all. We have now reached time. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for teaching me a lot about South Sudan as it is after 10 years. I hope you all enjoyed it as attendees, and I'm sure we're going to have another webinar next month, I believe, on either Northern or Western Bahr el Ghazal. And so thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.